Why do people, and especially women in the context of relationships, so often follow the ruthless over the romantic? It is a question as old as civilization itself. The gentle poet, flowers in hand, whispers promises of love. Yet too often, he is left standing in the shadows while the woman walks away with the conqueror. The commander, the man who bends others to his will, Niccolo Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat and thinker of the Renaissance, dared to put into words what most feared to admit, that human beings are not guided by ideals of kindness, but by the magnetic pull of power in The Prince, his infamous manual on leadership. Machiavelli declared that it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. While his words were aimed at rulers, their echo resounds far beyond politics. For if human nature is attracted to power and certainty, then this law applies just as much to the court of love as to the court of kings. The romantic man represents softness, vulnerability, and hope. The ruthless man represents security, dominance, and control. One may touch the heart, but the other seizes the imagination. One writes poems, the other writes history. This paradox, that women often choose the ruthless, is not simply a matter of cynicism, but of survival, psychology, and an unspoken truth about desire to understand it. We must descend into the mind of Machiavelli himself, walk the blood-stained streets of Renaissance Italy, and trace the shadow this philosophy casts over both history and modern relationships. Because Machiavelli was not merely writing about princes, he was writing about us. To understand Machiavelli's ruthless logic, we must first step into his world, Renaissance Florence. The city was a jewel of art, trade, and intellect, but beneath the painted ceilings of its chapels and palaces, Florence was a battlefield of ambition. Families like the Medici ruled and were overthrown. Alliances shifted like shadows at dusk. And betrayal was not the exception, but the rule. Machiavelli was not a philosopher sitting in quiet study. He was a diplomat. Watching the savage theater of power up close, he saw kings poisoned, allies betrayed, and entire cities crushed by the whims of a single ruler. And from this brutal stage, he drew his chilling conclusions. Human beings, he observed, are not guided by lofty ideals. They are selfish, fickle, and easily swayed by fear or advantage. Love, he argued, is fragile. It lasts only as long as it is convenient. Fear, however, endures because it is anchored in survival. In his infamous text, The Prince, 1513, written after he himself had been imprisoned and tortured, Machiavelli distilled a truth few dared to utter. A leader must be willing to be cruel when necessary, for cruelty, if used wisely, secures loyalty. Now, pause for a moment. Consider how these same dynamics play out in the realm of romance. The romantic man offers affection, tenderness, poetry. But what does Machiavelli's ruthless man offer? Certainty, safety, a sense that no matter what, he cannot be ignored. Florence's chaos taught Machiavelli a brutal rule. People gravitate not toward the gentle, but toward the strong. The same could be said of women navigating a dangerous world. They follow not the dreamer, but the man who appears capable of conquering danger itself. Machiavelli's Italy was drenched in blood and betrayal, and from it came a philosophy. When survival is at stake, romance is a luxury. Ruthlessness is the law. Betrayal was the common language of survival. One week, Florence bowed to French kings. The next, to Spanish armies. The Medici, once the mighty bankers of Europe, were exiled, then restored, then exiled again in this revolving door of fortune. Only one law remained constant. The strong devoured the weak. Machiavelli, as a civil servant, was thrust into the heart of these games. He negotiated with kings, courted alliances with mercenaries, and watched as promises of loyalty were discarded the moment a dagger offered a better bargain. What lesson could such a man learn except that human beings are loyal only when it serves them? Thus, when he wrote The Prince, he did not write for the dreamer who hoped the world might be kind. He wrote for the man who knew the world was not, and his advice was simple. Do not depend on love, depend on power, for if Florence could betray its own sons, if allies could become executioners overnight, then what use was the romantic illusion of eternal affection? Better to be feared, Machiavelli concluded, than to be left defenseless in the arms of love, fear, and desire. Here lies the crux of Machiavelli's insight. Love is conditional, but fear is binding. Love depends on circumstance. A people may love their ruler when times are good, But turn on him the moment famine strikes. A woman may adore a man's gentleness, but abandon him when that gentleness leaves her unprotected. Love is a fleeting currency, constantly devalued. Fear, however, is different. Fear endures. Fear compels. Fear roots itself in survival, and survival trumps sentiment for Machiavelli. This was not cynicism, it was biology, dressed in Renaissance prose. Human beings are wired to seek out the figure who can protect them, even if that protection comes with cruelty and in the realm of attraction. This translates into the paradox of desire. Women often follow not the tender romantic who whispers promises, but the ruthless man whose very presence commands reality to bend. The ruthless may wound hearts, but they offer something more primal, the promise that danger will not swallow those who stand beside them. This is why history, both political and personal, is littered with tales of women drawn not to poets, but to conquerors, from Cleopatra's entanglement with Caesar, to the courtesans of Florence who traded poems for patronage under the Medici. The pattern is constant. Power seduces more deeply than poetry. It is not that women despise romance. No, they crave it. But when forced to choose between safety and softness, between the fortress and the flower, survival whispers its verdict, and Machiavelli listened. The conqueror and the poet. History has always staged its cruel theater between two archetypes, the conqueror and the poet. The conqueror bends nations, his name carved into stone and remembered for centuries. The poet, though he may capture fleeting beauty, often fades into the margins of history. Machiavelli saw this pattern repeated endlessly, not because poetry lacks value, but because power demands memory. Consider Julius Caesar and his rival, the orator Cicero. Cicero was eloquent, his words sharper than steel, his speeches filled with ideals of justice and harmony. Women admired him, senators feared his wit, and he embodied the romantic belief that words could tame the world. Yet Cicero was slaughtered, his head and hands nailed to the Roman Forum as a warning. Caesar, ruthless and relentless, seduced Cleopatra, conquered Gaul, and altered the course of civilization. Or take Florence itself. Lorenzo de' Medici, called Il Magnifico, was not merely a banker but a prince of art and patronage. He wrote poetry, fostered beauty, and cherished music. Yet the Medici survived not through romance, but through their ruthless control of wealth, assassination plots, and alliances sealed in blood. Women may have swooned at Lorenzo's verses, but they followed the power of his purse and sword. The lesson was brutal. Romance might charm the heart, but ruthlessness secured loyalty, even in the myths of the Renaissance courts. The pattern reappeared. Gentle dreamers, no matter how adored in the moment, were swept aside when storms arrived. It was the ruthless man, the one feared and respected, who endured. Machiavelli recorded what others refused to. That affection is fragile, but authority, however cruel, endures like iron. And when survival and desire collide, desire bends to survival. This is why the conqueror claims history, and often the woman, while the poet is left only with his verses. Centuries have passed since Machiavelli's quill scratched ink across parchment, yet his cold observations on power remain eerily relevant, not only in politics, but in the hidden dynamics of love. Modern psychology has peeled back the layers of human attraction, and what it reveals often sounds more Machiavellian than romantic. At the core lies evolutionary instinct. For women across millennia, the stakes of choosing a partner were not trivial. The wrong choice could mean vulnerability, abandonment, or death. The man who charmed with tenderness but could not defend his family offered beauty without survival. The man who was ruthless, ambitious and commanding, however cruel, promised security. Attraction evolved not around poetry, but around protection. This does not mean women seek cruelty for its own sake. Rather, the qualities often bundled with ruthlessness, dominance, decisiveness, fearlessness, signal strength. They reassure the subconscious that here stands a man who can conquer hardship. Consider the phenomenon of the bad boy. Pop culture endlessly laments why women gravitate toward dangerous men instead of the safe, gentle suitor. Yet Machiavelli would not be surprised. To him, the answer is simple. Love is fragile, but the aura of strength creates loyalty. The bad boy may break hearts, but he radiates the ruthless certainty that commands attention. Psychologists call this the dominance effect. Studies show that women, when faced with stressful or uncertain environments, rate dominant men as more attractive than submissive ones. It is survival written into biology. When the world feels threatening, power seduces more than tenderness. Romantics, of course, dream otherwise. They believe affection should triumph over aggression, that kindness should eclipse cruelty, and in ideal circumstances, in safe, stable societies, romance thrives. But strip away stability, introduce chaos, and the old law returns. The ruthless are followed. The romantic are forgotten. Machiavelli, staring into the bloody politics of Florence, understood what science now confirms. Attraction is not primarily about ideals. It is about power dressed in desire. The dark allure of ruthlessness, if ruthlessness wounds, why does it also seduce? Why do countless stories, from ancient myths to modern tabloids, show women drawn to men whose power eclipses their compassion? The answer lies in the psychology of awe and danger. Ruthlessness creates a paradoxical magnetism. On the one hand, it threatens, reminding us of vulnerability. On the other, it demonstrates power so absolute that it feels untouchable. And in a world where survival often depends on proximity to strength, danger itself can become a kind of allure. Take the case of notorious rulers and conquerors. Napoleon Bonaparte, feared by half of Europe, inspired not only loyalty from armies, but obsession from admirers. Even in exile, women wrote him letters, begging for his attention. His ruthlessness on the battlefield did not repel. It drew fascination. Or consider the darker modern example. Infamous criminals who, despite their brutality, receive marriage proposals in prison. Society calls it madness. Yet psychology calls it the Machiavellian effect. Women are not responding to cruelty itself, but to the signal of dominance, control, and the primal promise of protection hidden within it. Ruthless men radiate certainty. They do not waver, do not beg, do not collapse under rejection. That unyielding posture, however destructive, mimics strength, and strength to the subconscious whispers of survival. Meanwhile, the romantic man, with his vulnerability and softness, risks appearing uncertain. His poetry may stir emotions, but it does not silence fear. He may be loved for his heart, but not followed for his power. This explains why literature, film, and history echo with the same trope. The gentle dreamer is adored in secret, but the ruthless figure commands devotion. Women may love the romantic, but they follow the ruthless. Machiavelli, centuries earlier, had already distilled this into his law of leadership. It is better to be feared than loved. Fear commands. Love pleads, and in the arena of desire, as in politics, command outweighs plea when romance still wins. Yet if ruthlessness always triumphed, the world would be nothing but tyrants and broken hearts. That is not the full story. Even Machiavelli, though infamous for praising fear, admitted a subtle truth. The ruler who is both feared and loved achieves the greatest power. The same balance applies in attraction, for while dominance can command attention, it cannot sustain affection forever. History offers its exceptions, men whose romance, gentleness, or vision won loyalty that force alone could never hold. Consider Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor of Rome. Unlike Caesar's ruthless ambition, Marcus ruled with wisdom, restraint, and moral clarity. His meditations reveal a man more concerned with justice than conquest. Yet he inspired devotion from soldiers and citizens alike. His strength lay not in cruelty, but in his integrity. And that integrity became its own form of power. Or look at literature's enduring icons. Jane Austen's Mr. Darcy begins as proud and commanding. Yet it is not his authority that secures Elizabeth Bennet's love. It is his transformation. His humility, his willingness to put love above arrogance. Romance, when combined with strength, can overcome ruthlessness. Psychology too confirms this. While dominance attracts in times of uncertainty, studies show that in stable environments, kindness, generosity, and emotional intelligence rise in value. Women may follow the ruthless when survival is threatened. But when security is assured, the romantic man shines the truth. Then is balance. The ruthless attracts, but the romantic endures. Power may seize the moment, but love, if grounded in strength, sustains the bond. Machiavelli's warning remains sharp. Never depend solely on love. Yet perhaps the deeper lesson is this: combine strength with compassion, authority with tenderness, and one need not choose between being feared or loved. One can be both. Machiavelli's warning for modern love. Machiavelli never wrote a dating manual. Yet his words, echoing from 1513, strike with unnerving accuracy at the heart of modern relationships. Scroll through today's culture, and you see the same paradox he observed in the courts of Florence. Romantic men lament being friend-zoned, bewildered as women chase after dominant, sometimes destructive figures. Meanwhile, the ruthless, whether CEOs, celebrities, or so-called bad boys, command attention, adoration, and loyalty, despite their flaws. Why? Because Machiavelli's principle remains alive. Love is fragile, but strength is magnetic. But here lies the danger. When attraction is guided solely by the ruthless pull of dominance, relationships risk collapsing into cycles of control and harm. Women who follow ruthless men may find themselves trapped in webs of manipulation or abuse. The security once promised transforms into a prison. Machiavelli would smirk at this irony. He warned that love cannot be relied upon, but he also cautioned rulers not to indulge in cruelty without restraint. For ruthlessness, unchecked, breeds rebellion. The same applies in love. Dominance without affection leads not to devotion, but to eventual escape. Modern psychology calls this the paradox of power. Yes, strength draws attention. Yes, ruthlessness commands loyalty in the short term. But without compassion, without romance, without the capacity to soften, the bond erodes. Fear compels, but it also breeds resentment. Machiavelli's shadow still hangs over relationships. Follow only the romantic and risk fragility. Follow only the ruthless and risk destruction. His advice was not to abandon love altogether, but to recognize its limits. True power lies in combining the authority of the ruthless with the warmth of the romantic in love. As in politics, the most enduring leaders are not those who wield cruelty alone, but those who master the art of balance. Women who chose power. If we wish to test Machiavelli's theory, we need only look at history's most famous women time and again. They chose not the dreamer who promised poetry, but the man who could promise survival, security, or empire. Take Cleopatra of Egypt. Her beauty is legendary, her charm immortalized, but her choices were calculated. She did not bind herself to mere romantics. Instead, she allied with Julius Caesar, the most ruthless general of his age. Later, she joined Mark Antony, not simply for passion, but because his command of armies offered protection for her throne. Cleopatra understood that affection alone could not preserve a kingdom. Power could. Or consider Catherine de' Medici, the Florentine noblewoman who became Queen of France, surrounded by courtly poets and idealists. Catherine placed her trust not in gentle dreamers, but in alliances with ruthless men who could enforce her will. Her reign was marked by intrigue, assassinations, and manipulation, a Machiavellian dance in which she survived decades of hostility. Even in more recent centuries, the pattern emerges. The courtesans of Europe's royal courts often drifted toward kings and generals, rather than artists and poets. Lord Byron may have inspired swoons with his verses, but it was Napoleon, ruthless on the battlefield, who captured the world's fascination. The message hidden in these choices is stark. Women navigating uncertain, dangerous worlds gravitated toward those who could wield power. They may have admired the romantic, but they entrusted their futures to the ruthless. This does not reduce women to opportunists. Rather, it highlights the brutal realities they faced. To attach oneself to weakness was to risk ruin. To stand beside strength, even if that strength came cloaked in cruelty, was to claim a measure of safety. If we wish to test Machiavelli's theory, we need only look at history's most famous women time and again. They chose not the dreamer who promised poetry, but the man who could promise survival, security, or empire. Take Cleopatra of Egypt. Her beauty is legendary, her charm immortalized. But her choices were calculated. She did not bind herself to mere romantics. Instead, she allied with Julius Caesar, the most ruthless general of his age. Later, she joined Mark Antony, not simply for passion, but because his command of armies offered protection for her throne. Cleopatra understood that affection alone could not preserve a kingdom. Power could. Or consider Catherine de' Medici, the Florentine noblewoman who became Queen of France surrounded by courtly poets and idealists. Catherine placed her trust not in gentle dreamers, but in alliances with ruthless men who could enforce her will. Her reign was marked by intrigue, assassinations, and manipulation, a Machiavellian dance in which she survived decades of hostility. Even in more recent centuries, the pattern emerges. The courtesans of Europe's royal courts often drifted toward kings and generals rather than artists and poets. Lord Byron may have inspired swoons with his verses, but it was Napoleon, ruthless on the battlefield, who captured the world's fascination. The message hidden in these choices is stark. Women navigating uncertain, dangerous worlds gravitated toward those who could wield power. They may have admired the romantic, but they entrusted their futures to the ruthless. This does not reduce women to opportunists. Rather, it highlights the brutal realities they faced. To attach oneself to weakness was to risk ruin. To stand beside strength, even if that strength came cloaked in cruelty, was to claim a measure of safety. And so, history remembers the conquerors, while the romantics linger in the shadows. Machiavelli, watching from Renaissance Florence, was not surprise to him. It was simply human nature. The friend zone and the prince modern culture has coined a phrase Machiavelli might have smirked at. The friend zone. It describes the fate of the romantic man who offers affection, loyalty, and tenderness, yet never inspires desire. He becomes a companion, a confidant, even a therapist, but rarely a lover. His tragedy is that he mistakes kindness for magnetism. Machiavelli would have said simply, he relies on love, and therefore he loses. For the nice guy embodies the same weakness Machiavelli warned princes against. He seeks to be loved at all costs, avoiding conflict, bending to please, but love, as Machiavelli knew, is fickle. It evaporates the moment strength is needed. Worse, it breeds contempt, just as citizens grow weary of a ruler who cannot defend them. Women grow indifferent to a man who cannot assert himself. By contrast, the ruthless, or at least the decisive and commanding man, avoids the friend zone because he projects what Machiavelli called virtù, the force of will that shapes destiny. He may not be nicer, but he radiates authority. That authority commands respect, and respect often precedes desire. This does not mean cruelty should be celebrated. Many confuse arrogance or abuse with true strength, and such men eventually collapse under their own brutality. But Machiavelli's insight is sharper. Women, like citizens, may forgive severity if it is paired with security. What they will not forgive is weakness disguised as devotion. Thus, the friend zone is not a mystery of modern dating apps or memes. It is simply the prince, rewritten for romance. To be only romantic is to risk irrelevance. To be only ruthless is to risk rebellion. To command both affection and fear, that is the balance Machiavelli advised, and the balance that still decides who is followed and who is forgotten when ruthlessness is misread as romance. One of the most fascinating paradoxes in human psychology is the tendency to misread ruthless behavior as romantic passion. A man who refuses to take no for an answer may be condemned in one context, yet in another he is seen as the persistent lover. A man who seizes control of a situation with commanding authority may appear domineering, yet to some he is interpreted as protective. Machiavelli would point out that this confusion arises because human beings are wired to respond not only to what is done, but to how it is framed. Ruthlessness that appears intentional, controlled, and purposeful is often mistaken for intensity and dedication. In relationships, this creates the dangerous illusion that the ruthless are more invested, more passionate, and therefore more romantic. The romantic, by contrast, often fails because his kindness seems passive. His lack of confrontation, his willingness to step aside, can be reframed as weakness or lack of desire. Thus, paradoxically, the man who burns the bridge is often remembered more vividly than the one who built it. The political theater of love in The Prince. Machiavelli emphasizes that rulers must always act with the awareness that they are on stage. They do not simply rule, they perform rule. In much the same way, the ruthless suitor understands that love is theater, and perception is everything. He knows how to appear mysterious, how to present his ambition as passion, his aggression as confidence. He controls the narrative around his behavior. When he disappears, it is not framed as neglect, it becomes a test of loyalty. When he speaks with sharpness, it is not seen as cruelty, it becomes evidence of strength. The romantic, on the other hand, does not understand this theater. He believes love is private. Intimate and pure, he gives openly, without performance. But in doing so, he makes himself invisible in the public stage of desire. Love, in society's eyes, is not only about what is felt, it is about what is seen. Machiavelli might therefore advise: if you wish to win affection, do not simply feel it, display it with strategy, with timing, with an awareness of the audience's gaze. Fear, desire, and the biology of attraction. Modern neuroscience provides evidence that aligns uncannily with Machiavelli's observations. When humans experience uncertainty, when they are confronted with power, or when they fear loss, their brains release higher levels of dopamine and adrenaline. These neurochemicals are strongly linked to arousal, attention, and attachment. The ruthless man thrives on this biology. His unpredictability keeps his partner guessing. His dominance triggers both fear and fascination. The romantic, on the other hand, induces comfort, stability, and predictability, qualities that are important for long-term security but far less effective in generating the chemical cocktail of immediate desire. Machiavelli, though centuries removed from neuroscience, understood this intuitively. People are drawn to the unpredictable because it awakens their emotions more powerfully than the stable ever could.